Last formal talk for today. As Martin said, my name is Lauren and I'm a pharmacologist and research fellow here at Sick Kids. Unlike my former supervisor, Mike Reeder, I do not have any dose response curves or even a chemical structure to share with you today. But what I am going to talk about is a research project that has been ongoing for the last year or so to create standards for a pediatric drug monograph. I also have no conflicts of interest. So it's almost cliche now to say that, children are not small adults, and it's something that we've been talking about in the world of pediatric drug prescribing for many years. And drug prescribing in children must consider their unique exposures, and this includes things like drug exposure in pregnancy as well as exposure through lactation. And as we've heard and seen the very infamous Greg Kern's slide, there's dynamic organ maturation, that can result in very unpredictable, highly variable drug response. And this is especially true in premature infants. We have also heard today that off-label use is very common. And what the AAP has said last year about off-label use is that it's acceptable if it's based on sound scientific evidence, expert medical judgment, or published literature. Now, I'm myself not a prescriber, but I can imagine if you're trying to make a decision about what drug to give a patient in an emergency situation, you don't have time to go to the PubMed or, find a colleague who may know about this. So what really is the best way to get this evidence to the prescribers? And that's where we really think a formulary comes into play. And adherence to a formulary is really an essential component for rational and harmonized drug prescribing. Now, just to clarify, when I say prescribing in the context of this presentation, I'm not just referring to the pediatricians or medical doctors. I'm referring to anyone who selects, prescribes, dispenses, prepares, administers, monitors, or advises on medicines for children. So we're taking a broad approach to look at all components of a healthcare team. So what a formulary is a collection of drug monographs. And this here is the Health Canada definition that says a drug monograph is a scientific document on a drug that, devoid of promotional material, describes the properties, claims, indications, and conditions of use for the drug, and that contains any other information that may be required for optimal, safe, and effective use. Now, most of the monographs that are available focus on adult pharmacotherapy and really have these blanket statements regarding prescribing in children. So this I actually pulled yesterday off the FDA's website. They have a collection of drug monographs, and it's for morphine. And you see pediatric use, safety and effectiveness, and pharmacokinetics in pediatric patients has not been established. And this really led us to question, okay, well, what information do the prescribers need in a drug monograph in order to be able to safely and effectively provide the right drug in the right dose, at the right time, to the right patient, via the right route of administration? So the objective of this study was to generate standards for items to be included in a pediatric drug monograph using a consensus-based approach. Our secondary objectives were to determine which of these items were the most important or the highest ranking, and also to determine which of these items were specific pediatric drug monograph items. As you can imagine, a lot of the items are important for both prescribing in adults and children, mechanism of metabolism, volume of distribution, and all that. So we wanted to figure out which items were really specific to pediatrics. So what did we do? We started by establishing our steering committee, most of which you have heard from today already. Then we reviewed all of the existing formularies that we could find for both adult and pediatric drug monograph items. We then recruited an international group of participants, and I'm not sure if Tony Nunn is still with us, but we call it a purposive sample. And what that means is that we as a steering committee decided who would be the most appropriate participants for this study. We then initiated a Delphi. In the first round of the Delphi, participants were asked to score the items that we had found on other existing drug monographs, and they were also able to suggest new items that hadn't been previously reported. This then went through a second round where participants rescored the first items, and also scored all of the new items that were suggested by all of the participants in that first round. Yesterday, we had a very fruitful consensus meeting of our steering committee, and the last step is dissemination of our findings, which is happening right now. So you guys are the first to hear about this because we finalized it about 6 p.m. last night. Our steering committee, as I said, you've heard from most of these individuals today already. We had Dr. Carol Takatomo, who's the editor of the Children's Hospital of LA's Pediatric Dosing Handbook in the United States. We had Tony Nunn, who was so kind enough to join us from the UK. David Woods, who is, of course, the editorial director for the NZFC. Professor Dr. Matthias de Hoog, who is Martin's co-founder of the Kinderformularium in the Netherlands, as well as our very own chair of our Sick Kids Drugs and Therapeutics Committee, who you just heard from, Dr. Shinya Ito. And this committee was chaired by myself and Martin Afringa. So the participants that we were looking for were those who select, prescribe, dispense, prepare, administer, monitor, and advise on medicines for children. Again, we were trying to create a comprehensive resource, so we really just didn't want to stick with only drug prescribers. We invited 46 individuals from 25 different countries to participate. So we tried to get a global perspective, and we also tried to recruit participants from different subspecialties. So we didn't want only clinical pharmacologists. We collected some demographic data, including their job title, their number of years of experience, the country of which they practice, their subspecialty, and their preferred source of drug prescribing information. How did we define importance? So we asked participants to rate these drug monograph items, rate their importance on a 1 to 5 Likert scale. And importance was defined as the item's value to be included in a drug monograph specific for use by any health professional in terms of facilitating their ability to safely prescribe medicines for children. We used REDCap, hosted at the Hospital for Sick Children, in order to collect anonymized data. And this is the scale that they were asked to rank. So number 1 was not important at all to be included on a pediatric drug monograph, and 5 was a very important item to be included on a pediatric drug monograph. We also then determined which items were pediatric specific. And how we did that, it was a process where our steering committee had to agree by consensus that this was an item that was unlikely to be of value to those prescribing medicines in the adult population. So our results, we managed to have to recruit 31 participants. So out of the 46 that were invited, that was a 67% response rate. And 29 of these participants successfully completed both rounds. So we only lost 2 participants, which we thought was pretty good. The dots here represent the countries for which the participants were practicing. So we did manage to have participants from 6 continents. Who were these participants? We had almost half, a little more than half actually were physicians, 30% roughly were pharmacists. We only had a small representation from nurses, and we had 1 scientist and 1 who was undeclared. In terms of their specialty areas, excluding pharmacy and pediatric medicine, we had quite a few clinical pharmacologists, some neonatologists, intensive care, emergency medicine, family medicine, psychiatry, heme-onc, pulmonology, and rheumatology. And as you can see, the number of years practicing, we had quite an experienced group of participants. So the majority were practicing for greater than 11 years, and quite a good chunk were practicing for more than 26 years. So we asked participants, we provided them these 11 types of ways you could find information on drug prescribing, and we asked them to rank them. So in order from the first resource you would consult to the last resource you would consult, how would you go about looking for information on medicines for children? So the first, or the top rated source for prescribing information, was a pediatric formulary, followed by systematic reviews, clinical practice guidelines, local or hospital formularies, National Pediatric Association guidelines, so guidelines maybe from CPS or AAP, followed by clinical trials, adult formularies, local protocols, expert opinion, information from industry, and pleasant surprise, a Google search or a generic search was the last resource. So that was good. Oh, so it's the numbers, it's the scores. So it was a sum of ranks. So 45 means, it could mean, 30 people rated it number 1. So the lower score means it scored higher. It was more frequently chosen first. Is that clear? Sorry if that wasn't clear. Yeah, it's sum of ranks. So which formularies were they consulting? As you can see, there's a lot of variability and quite a few formularies that were only reported by one individual. But surprisingly, and we only had two actually British participants, almost half of our participants reported consulting the BNFC. So some of the other popular formularies included the BNF, which is for adults, Kinder Formularium, neonatal and pediatric Lexi drugs, as well as the World Health Organization model formulary. Now, with the BNFC, we think perhaps because we only recruited English-speaking participants, this might have sort of biased that sample a little bit. Just a little caveat there. So the items. Our initial environmental scan found 88 unique drug monograph items. So these were the items that went into that first round of the Delphi, and we completed that round in January of 2015. Following that first round, we had 41 new items suggested by our participants. So this made a total of 129 items that went into the second round of the Delphi. And before we had done our second round, as a committee, we decided that if anything scored 4 or higher, we would include it. And if anything scored below 3, we would exclude it. So following the second round, we included 37 items that scored a median of 5 out of 5. 6 items scored between 4 and 5, and 73 items scored 4 out of 5. We also excluded 3 items that scored less than 3 out of 5. So the median scores which were above 3 but less than 4 were the items that we took to our consensus meeting yesterday. So in our consensus meeting, we included 3 of these items. We excluded 7 items. We also ended up combining one of the items. So there were originally 2 items that were a dose increase resulting from a drug-drug interaction and a dose decrease resulting from drug-drug interaction, which were combined to a dose increase/decrease in drug-drug interactions because they scored the same mean score and the same median score. So we combined those 2 items. We also removed 2 items. So there were 2 items which were originally included that were the age-weight conversion and the instructions for how to report adverse drug reactions and contribute to phase 4 information. We felt that these were very important information to have in a formulary, but were not necessarily drug specific. So if you're reporting an adverse drug reaction for a cyclovir or for morphine, it's the same process to go through MedWatch at the FDA, for example. So we felt that this was not specific for the drug, so we removed those 2 items. So this gave us a total of 116 items to be included in a pediatric drug monograph. So I just thought I'd talk about some of the decisions that we made at our consensus meeting yesterday. So these were the items that scored above 3 but less than 4. So the first item was the manufacturer. And we decided to exclude this item because we felt that pharmaceutical companies are constantly combining and working on things together, and we felt that if GSK or Bristol Myers Squibb was manufacturing the drug, that wouldn't necessarily affect your decision to prescribe it or not. So we felt that this was important information that could be added as an appendix, but wouldn't necessarily be an essential component of a drug monograph. We did, however, feel that the out-of-pocket cost for the patient was an important item, an important secondary consideration when selecting a medicine to prescribe to children, and not only at the individual patient cost, but also as a cost to the healthcare system, and especially in the developing world where you have to be really considerate of what these drugs cost. So we included the cost of the medication. We excluded the World Health Organization Essential Medicines list, as we felt that if a medicine was not on this list, it would not really prevent prescribers from using it. We did, however, include the availability of local clinical practice guidelines, and we actually recommend that if there are local clinical practice guidelines that are available on a web link, that should be connected right into the drug monograph. We excluded the chemical and empirical formula because we felt that wasn't going to influence prescribing. The isomer ratio we also excluded. And this is because we felt that for drugs such as methadone or ketamine, where the enantiomers have different activity, they should actually have separate monographs. So we excluded that as an item. We also excluded the animal study toxicology and fertility repo toxicology in animals. And this is because we felt that it took a lot of specialty to understand and be able to translate animal data into human response. So we felt, again, that this is important information, but maybe not necessarily an essential item for a drug monograph. Now, ontogeny of enzymes involved in metabolism and clearance. This was a shocker to us because we felt as a committee that this is a very important item for a pediatric drug monograph. However, it scored rather low, and we think this may be due to the terminology, and perhaps ontogeny is really how we describe it in maybe North America and Europe, and maybe there was some misinterpretation in other places of the world. So we did include ontogeny as a monograph item. We also excluded dosing in drug and alcohol addiction, and that was because this is an item that was suggested after the first round. And we weren't really clear what this item was getting at. There are other items to address dosing in renal impairment or hepatic impairment, and we weren't really sure how that would be different in drug and alcohol addiction, or if this item was meant to suggest if you have a teenager who's addicted to alcohol, you shouldn't prescribe benzodiazepines. We weren't clear on the item, so that was a reason for us to exclude it. So in general, all of the items were classified under one of 7 different categories. General information, and this includes things like the manufacturer name, brand name, when the monograph is updated, who's updating it. Adverse drug reactions and overdose, drug-drug interactions, dosing, precautions, formulation, and of course the properties of the drug. Yes, so I discussed already that we removed how to report adverse drug reactions and the age-weight conversion because, again, we didn't feel those were necessarily drug-specific. We also, as we were looking at this data, we thought, do pharmacists and physicians feel the same way about these items? Is what's important to a physician important to a pharmacist? And actually the answer was yes. So we only had 7%. So only 8 items were scored differently between the pharmacists and the medical doctors. And these were things like handling precautions, recipes for extemporaneous formulations, etc. Now, because there are 116 items, and we'd like to get out of here at some point today, I'm not going to discuss all of them. So today I'm going to talk about the highest ranking items and the pediatric specific items. But what we're going to do is for everyone that has registered, we will send out a link to the website and we'll publish all 116 articles there, items there, and you can kind of peruse through that at your leisure. So what we defined as the highest ranking items were items that scored 5 out of 5 on a median and more than 4.5 on an average. So as Letterman would do the top 10, our top 10 items were contraindication due to drug-drug interaction, the generic drug name, contraindicated populations, dosing for licensed indication by age group and by route of administration, impairment of drug elimination organs, precautions or groups where adverse drug reactions may be more common, routes of administration, dosing in preterm newborns or premature newborns, dosing for off-label indications, and considerations for dosing dependent on the route of administration. In terms of the items that were pediatric specific, 30 of our items, so 26%, were deemed by our steering committee to be specific pediatric drug monograph items. So just some examples of that include the effects on long-term development, dosing in neonates, premature babies, obese children, malnourished children, pregnant teenagers, ontogeny, evidence for off-label indication and off-label dosing, as well as effects of bilirubin levels in neonates. But what was most surprising to us is of those highest ranking items, 42% of them were pediatric specific. So what does this all mean? Well, we showed that pediatric formularies are a frequently consulted source of information for drug prescribers that are prescribing medicines to children. And we also showed that there was significant, correspondence between how pharmacists and medical doctors, what information they needed. So this means if we can create a really well-established evidence-based monograph, we can actually service both of these types of healthcare providers. Also, nearly half of the most important items were pediatric specific. This is information that you're not going to be able to find in an adult monograph. And we also feel that these items are useful when industry is developing new medicines, because it really tells you what's the end line, what's the information the prescribers are going to need in order to use your drug. But also useful for academics who may be working with Shinya, working on investigational use, in order to determine what information is going to be needed. But of course, some limitations to this study, including our relatively small, convenient sample, and a lack of representation from medication administrators. So we really did want to include a lot more nurses, and this might be something that we do with a nursing group separately. And the biggest limitation of all is, while there are 116 items that prescribers are looking for, we are well aware that most of this information does not exist. So unfortunately, we don't discuss how to actually, where to find this information, because again, sometimes it just doesn't exist. So I just thought I'd talk about two initiatives from our group that we had discussed going forward. Was to identify, the first is to identify what parents and patients need from a drug monograph. So they of course would like reliable information that's in a lay format, perhaps with some pictograms, an online resource, something that's free, open access, available from their phone or their laptop. But we want to really assess what are their outpatient concerns. So things like, my child missed their dose this morning, what do I do now? So we would like to perhaps we should be contacting the MCRN group in the UK, because it sounds like they have a good network of patient and parent groups to work with. Now this has been discussed, I think, by Martin as well as Shinya and David. What we don't know is how much evidence is enough evidence. So what our group really discussed quite a bit yesterday is how much evidence do we need in order to put that drug, take it from off evidence to on evidence. How much evidence is enough evidence? So I took this quote again from the AAP that says, therapeutic decision making should be guided by the best available evidence. For the pediatric population, gold standard clinical trials are often not available. So practitioners must rely on either less definitive information, such as expert opinion for the age group that they're treating, or the use of evidence from a different population to guide practice. So, we've all seen these evidence pyramids that show systematic reviews and randomized clinical trials, but in pediatrics, sometimes that's just not feasible, and especially in cases like rare diseases where we just don't have enough patients to be able to generate this high level of evidence. So something that we had discussed was really the need for these evidence tier categories. So for this indication in this age group, what is an appropriate level of evidence? So that is definitely some more work needed there. So why is this important? Well, drug monographs make up the pediatric formulary, and I think we always talk about all this great research that's done, but it's not used at the bedside or put into practice. So I really see a formulary as a tool to be able to inform prescribers about some of the research that has been done, but also for prescribers to be able to tell researchers what information they need, what research studies need to be done in order to generate the evidence that they need. So now that we know what information healthcare providers want, it really means nothing to us if we don't put it into action. So it's great that there are 116 items, but what are we going to do with this information? And this is, again, a report that Martin discussed earlier, and it's also my last slide, and it's recommendations from the Canadian Council of Academies. And it says, a pan-Canadian prescribing resource such as a formulary could provide clear guidance to prescribers with standards for administering medications to children. Such a resource should be comprehensive, specific to children, up-to-date, and accessible across the country, and can improve consistency and accuracy in the real-world use of evidence, or of medicine. So I think I'm going to end there. I just wanted to take a little time to acknowledge all of our wonderful participants that really come from all over the world, and invite you guys to all follow us on Twitter. We've had some good discussion going on today already. And I think with that, I will open the floor for some questions, and then we will have our panel.